Is this the all-purpose grinder we've all been waiting for? And do you really need a truckload of beans to season it? Well, let's find out. Thank you for bombarding us with comments and messages asking us to review this grinder. It kind of arm-twisted TIMEMORE into sending us this unit. No money exchanged hands, and they don't get to watch this before any of you do. A huge thanks to Benki Brewing Tools as always for helping with all of the logistics. Thanks to Quick Brown Fox Coffee Roasters for sending us some yummy coffee that we used to test this grinder out with. If you're in India and you're looking for some excellent coffee, definitely check them out. The link is in the description below. And lastly, this video has a sponsor, Third Wave Water, but more on that later on. Okay, to avoid being redundant, I'll only cover the minor differences between the 78 and 78S and spend the bulk of my time talking about the buzz and how they perform for both espresso and filter. So if you missed our 078 review, then I highly recommend you watch that too. It's linked up here and in the description below. Okay, so when it comes to design, like I just mentioned, this grinder is near identical to the 78, so it has most of the same pros and cons. The things that annoyed me with the 78, like the hopper, are just as annoying here, and everything I loved about that grinder is mostly relevant here too. Oh, I'm still obsessed with the rotary grounds knocker, by the way. It's so satisfying, kind of like a fidget toy. But I should mention, however, when grinding for espresso, the finer grounds need quite a few more clicks to fully clear out the chute. I have no issues with that, but I can see some of you being a bit annoyed by that. The other noticeable difference is that this grinder is stepless, unlike the 78, and this is super useful for espresso, where you often need to make minute adjustments. The dial can be a bit sticky at times, and that little bit of extra force required to get it moving means you often overshoot your intended setting. This can be quite frustrating when you're trying to make small changes. It also doesn't help that the espresso range is fairly narrow. Depending on what RPM you're at, and I'll talk about RPM a little later on, you could be anywhere between 0 and 3 on the dial, and that's a pretty narrow angle of rotation. I wish the thread pitch was smaller and they didn't have the hard stops at 0 and 18. The pitch is basically the distance between two threads on a screw, and the smaller this is, the less the burrs will move apart for a given angle of rotation, and the more fine control you have. But even as is, the feel and resistance of the dial once in motion is very nice and pretty easy to use. Now, speaking of thread pitch, a lot of you asked if it's the same on the 78 and the S, and the answer is no. The pitch on the 78S is lower, meaning that the burrs move less for the same angle of rotation. So if you ever do put the turbo burrs in here, then just remember that you're not getting the same range of grind sizes that you would going from 0 to 18 on the 78. This is not such a big deal as calibration is super simple, and all you need to do is move this little pin based on whether you want your overall grind range to be coarser or finer. But on the other hand, if you own the 78 and you decide to put espresso burrs in, that's a bigger of an issue. You definitely want to mod it to be stepless, but you still won't get the granularity you do with the 78S because that thread pitch is higher. That's definitely something to keep in mind. Oh, and lastly, I think this matte black is sick, but scratches are more visible, and I wish the hopper didn't have such a dark tint so I could see a little more of the chaos going on inside. So yeah, that's about it. Apart from these minor differences, the two grinders are identical otherwise, except of course for the burrs. I know, most of you are here for this, and the wait has been unbearable. So let's get to it. Now, before we talk about how these burrs taste, we need to address the rumors that have been floating around regarding seasoning. It's nuts because the moment we received this grinder, we were bombarded with messages and DMs, and the numbers sounded a bit ridiculous. There was chatter about 6 to 10 kgs to season these burrs, which don't look like they're coated. Well, the TLDR is the rumors are unfortunately true. So if you've ordered this grinder or are thinking of buying it, then listen up, because here's a story of how we tamed this beast. One thing I forgot to mention is burr alignment. Now, our unit was excellent straight out of the box, yours may not be. So I recommend you check that first before spending the next 6 months seasoning this grinder. Straight out of the box, this thing is about as predictable as Instagram's algorithm. The shots had a sharp, unpleasant, one-dimensional acidity and an awful bitterness in the finish. Now, this is pretty standard for shots that have channeled quite heavily, but even the ones that looked like they ran okay still sported these delightful characteristics. But I've tested enough grinders now to know that this is not uncommon with new burrs, so the first order of business was to season. But instead of just putting 10 kilos through it, like so many people recommended. I wanted to see how seasoning progressed every couple of kilos, so here's how things went. After running about 2 kilos through it at a setting of 5, things improved a bit. From being nearly unusable, it started to produce acceptable shots with medium dark and dark roasts, which are more forgiving, at lower RPMs, but was still quite unpredictable. And anything medium and lighter, it felt like I could do a better job with a mortar and pestle. So I decided to put another kilo or so of coffee through it. At this point, things were improving, but quite incrementally. I was still struggling to pull back-to-back shots without changing anything and get similar results. The other thing that persisted was the unpleasantly sharp acidity, and the cups just lacked sweetness. Even coffees that were more developed and very sweet, like the MS Estate Medium Roast from QBF, had this unpleasant sharpness that was nearly impossible to tame. This was about a week into testing this grinder, so I ran a couple more kilos through it and went to bed. I had now put around 7 kilos through this grinder and was kind of losing hope. But the following morning, I woke up and pulled 2 shots for Namisha and me, and after taking a sip, we both had the same super confused expression. Like magic, somewhere between the 6 and 7 kilo mark of seasoning, it suddenly felt like I was using a different grinder. Though we'd been brewing the same coffee for a week now, Namisha even asked if it was a different one. If I had to distill it down to one word, it would be balance. The shots had been transformed. They were substantially sweeter than anything we were able to pull before. More complex and structured, and the acidity had so much more character now. Kinda like my transformation on completing finishing school. At this point, I was both excited and rather annoyed. I mean, if it takes 5 to 10 kilos to get to peak performance, that's one thing. But to have it be almost unusable, at least for espresso, until you put kilos and kilos through the grinder, is a bit ridiculous. It's like buying a brand new sports car and being told that you need to rev the engine for 80 hours before it'll start moving. Just a word of advice though, when seasoning, don't grind more than 1.5 to 2 kilos in one go. While this has a beefy motor, it's still not a commercial grinder and does get quite hot. Give it a couple of hours to cool down before doing the next batch. Okay, before we talk about taste, this video is sponsored by Third Wave Water and is our first ever sponsored video. We switched from making our own brew water to Third Wave Water about a year ago, and subsequently also had the pleasure of meeting the founders of Third Wave Water at Expo in Portland. So this collaboration just felt right. Depending on how you brew it, around 90 to 98% of your coffee is water, and the minerals in the water determine how the flavors extracted from your coffee are presented. If you've never tried custom brew water, then get ready to have your mind blown. Just snip the sachet, dump it in distilled water, and brew delicious cups of coffee. It's honestly the easiest way to make your own brew water. For us, switching to Third Wave Water has made life a whole lot easier. No more faffing with sourcing the right minerals and making sure they're food safe, carefully weighing and mixing them, or even dealing with liquid concentrates. Also, depending on how you brew and what kind of coffee you enjoy, Third Wave Water have a bunch of profiles for you to choose from, with more on the way. For example, we've been using this espresso profile to test the Profitec Pro 700, and we've been getting great tasting shots without having to worry about scale and corrosion damaging this expensive machine. These guys are the OGs when it comes to brew water mixes, and they know what's up. So thank you Third Wave Water for sponsoring this video. You can use the link in the description below to get 10% off anything you purchase on their store, and it also helps support this channel. Alright. Now that these damn burrs are finally usable, let's talk taste, starting with espresso. Like I said earlier, to my palate, I'd describe these burrs as very balanced, and I really enjoy the shots it produces. While you don't get clear separation of flavor like you do with higher clarity burrs like the SSP Multipurpose, the way that these burrs present the flavors inherent in the coffee is very enjoyable. For example, the shots pulled with the 78S were consistently more complex and nuanced than anything I was able to manage with the J-Max or the Minio XL. You get the texture, the chocolate, and nuts that we know and love from more traditional style burrs, but you also have vibrancy and fairly structured acidity, which made these shots way more interesting to me. With the 78S, I find that you're kind of bang in the middle of traditional and modern espresso. While things are slowly shifting, most people's preference, especially when it comes to espresso, is still largely concentrated on the traditional end of the spectrum. I'm not sure if TIMEMORE intentionally did this, but these burrs seem like the perfect crossover. It caters to the vast majority of people who enjoy their thick, chocolatey shots, while also teasing them with what they're missing out on the other side. It also does really well with milk-based drinks. So that's espresso. And moving to filter, we have a similar story with the 78S being able to produce sweet and balanced cups of coffee with moderate clarity. I say this a lot, but describing how burrs taste is tricky, so I keep trying to find new ways to communicate this better. I love using analogies in these situations, so here goes. Now, we talk a lot about clarity and separation of flavors in specialty coffee, and I'm going to try and use art to compare different burr sets. I know, just humor me for a second. Okay, imagine you're at one of the most famous museums in the world, the Uffizi in Florence, standing 3 feet away from the Birth of Venus painting by Botticelli. It's a stunning piece and you get to experience it as a whole, but lean in a little and you start to see the beautiful subtle details. The texture of the canvas, the paint strokes, intricate details of hair and fabric. This is like having very high clarity burrs like the SSP multipurpose and the turbos on the 78. Okay, move from that to the 78S and it's like looking at a really nice print of the same Botticelli painting. It's still a very pretty picture, but you lose a lot of the details and nuance. Go from there to the 65mm flats in the Mignon, and it's like looking at something I painted. Just kidding. The XL burrs are fine, they just don't do as well as the 78S in my opinion. So the point I'm trying to make here is, as far as all-purpose burrs go, these do a really good job. I'd call them all-purpose with a skew towards espresso, if that makes sense. Just remember that it's a no-purpose grinder until you season it. Okay. I just wanted to quickly talk about RPM before moving on to who this grinder is for. RPM is a weird one because no one really knows what the hell is going on. Research is very nascent and so far we've seen that conical burrs tend to produce fewer fines at lower RPMs. With flats, it's a bit more random. I heard Jonathan Garnier mention in a video that the ULF burrs in his EG1 actually grind finer at higher RPMs. What I've experienced with the 78S is the opposite. Higher RPMs have given me coarser grounds and I've had to go finer on the dial to match shot times. But apart from this, I haven't really noticed a massive difference in the profile of the shots produced. But like I said in our 078 review, play around with it and see what happens. It's fun and I wouldn't be surprised if RPM profiling is a thing in the not so distant future. Okay, time for recommendations. So if you're someone who's regularly pulling acid bomb turbo shots with light roasts and hoping to pick out every tasting note on the bag, then you should probably pass on this grinder. For most other espresso drinkers who also enjoy filter, the 78S is an excellent choice. It has its flaws, but you get really good build quality, good workflow, and a solid burr set that can produce tasty cups of coffee across brew methods. And it's easy on the eyes. So if you manage to snag this at the Kickstarter price, then you got yourself a killer deal. But even at MRP, I still think it's a solid choice. Just make sure you have a sack full of old beans to season it. That being said, if you don't care about espresso, then definitely get the 78 instead. That grinder is phenomenal for filter. And as we wrap yet another grinder review up, the next grinder arrives. Also, I think TIMEMORE grinders are slowly starting to ship to backers all over the world. So if you've received yours, then I'd love to hear what your experience has been and whether it aligns with mine. Let me know in the comments below. And as always, thank you so much for watching and brew aram se.